Hello, everyone.
Hello!
Thanks for joining us again here for our Haven StreamCast on the right day at the right time this week.
Right, I know, it's been a while since we were right day, right time.
And what a day for it to be the right day, right time. So we
I
got
know! I didn't even realize it was gonna happen, and then I was so happy.
yeah, it's one of those things which I'll be honest, my own birthday sneaks up on me because I don't even think about it. But I have in my phone on my Google Calendar, I've got a day that just says Port Haven Day to remind me that it's the anniversary of when our site was created. Um, and that's today. So happy birthday, Port Haven. It's been
Happy birthday, Port Haven. I know you texted me that, and I freaked out. I was like, oh my gosh!
it's been a whole 7 years. So again,
7 years.
if you've
Oh my
watched our Zero episode, then you know
Yeah,
this already because we talked about it. But while our YouTube and Twitter presence is, I guess, a little over a year old, really in kind of the serious way that we've been doing it. Um, Port Haven as a site has existed again for 7 years now, since April of 2011.
yep.
It's a
I was a
long time.
junior in college.
Yeah, I had already graduated and was in grad school, and that's still the case. So we won't think about that too much. But it is a weird thing to think about how long. Again, we've been around as a site, and again, we've become very different now than we were then, in
Yep.
ways that I think are mostly good.
Yes.
Um, but
Well, it's
happy,
crazy. I was even thinking like that means because so again, if you've seen the Zero episode, you know Port Haven got started because there used to be official forums on StarWars.com, and I joined those forums about a year before they shut down. So that means I've known Django for like 8 years,
yeah,
which is pretty crazy.
yeah, we're old friends now.
Yeah, right.
At,
Old
at,
friends that have still never met
at some point that
at some
happened.
point.
Um, but yeah, so it's I don't know, it's just crazy to me, and I'm glad that this kind of ended up being this way, where we could do this on today.
Yeah.
But no, it is so crazy to think about. Um, I mean, and really too. So some of the people that are on Port Haven. So I was on the Star Wars message boards
Hmm.
for almost 10 years before they shut down. So some of those people I'm coming up on like almost 20 years, having known them, like at
Dang.
least 15 years. Um, it's been a while.
It's funny. One of the other admin at Port Haven goes by the name of the Dark Moose because he is in fact a moose.
Yep,
Um,
of course.
Obviously, and I remember him. So I didn't join the Star Wars forums, but there used to be a Star Wars blog site that you could get if you were part of Hyperspace, which was the fan
Right,
club. And I remember around the time Revenge of the Sith came out, I was reading a lot of the blogs more than I was the forums. And
right,
Moose had amazing blogs, which he continues to grace Port Haven with every now and again.
sure.
Very fantastic, like deep thinker, but also funny. And I remember reading his stuff and a couple other people, but it was funny because then he was like the Dark Moose, that blogger I read sometimes. And like now it's just like Moose, who like I send weird tweet DMs to, and he's just like, "What does that mean? What is Discord?" It's like, oh, okay.
But yeah, it's crazy. Just to think about. One, it's a sign of how old I am. Um, because like I joined the original Star Wars forums right before Attack of the Clones came out. So like
That's crazy.
that's been so long ago. At least now, anyway. Um, but so other things we want to talk about, we can always talk about Port Haven because, as anybody that's been to our forums knows, the favorite topic of discussion on Port Haven is Port Haven. Um, so
Exactly, right?
so
I
we're
even
we're
made that a meme
always
once.
we're always down to talk about Port Haven. Um, but we also wanted to talk today. We've been having some discussions on our forums lately. This has kind of
Mhm.
grown out of that, about what makes Star Wars Star Wars. Like, what is
Right.
it that is kind of essential to Star Wars, such that, if a film or a book or a game didn't have this stuff, what it wouldn't feel like Star Wars, or
Right.
what examples are kind of the most Star Wars of all the Star Wars things. And you and I have read and played and watched a lot of Star Wars
A
things.
lot of Star Wars, definitely.
So we have a lot of different examples. And so while you're watching this in the comments in the chat, be sure to talk to us about what kind of things you think are kind of the most Star Wars of all the examples of Star Wars, or what those things are for you that
or
are kind
even
of
what they have, like their elements within them.
sure, yeah. Or like, what are the boundaries of Star Wars? Like, what would be too far to still be Star Wars for you? But while we wait for the chat to catch up some, what are some of those things for you? Like, what are those things that are like essential Star Wars for Yoda Bauer?
Well, it's funny. We were talking a little bit before we got started about how there's things in novels or comics that we would like accept as Star Wars that we might not in a film.
Right.
I think about some of the material, the Star Wars material that has just defined how I think about different elements of Star Wars, and I don't think they would make very good Star Wars movies. But one of my favorite things of all time is Shatter Point by Matthew Stover. And that book, in so many ways, I actually tweeted about this recently, that book in so many ways defined what the Jedi Order is to me. And you get into like Mace Windu's journals, and he talks about how he's got this passage that I read over and over again about how the fact that Jedi fight for peace is actually a misleading slogan, and that Jedi actually fight for civilization and this whole thing. And it really defined how I see the Jedi Order. But if they were to make it a movie, it would be Apocalypse Now in space, which isn't a bad thing. Apocalypse Now in space sounds pretty cool. But I don't know that it would feel like Star Wars. It had a lot more like graphic, like violence in it that you're not used to seeing in Star Wars. Even more so than what you get like in Rogue One, which still wasn't really that graphic.
Right.
It had more cursing than I'm used to in Star Wars, even though it was all space cursing. So it was like Tusker poop, like whoa, big words there. But still, it was just kind of funny how it played. And so I think it's kind of weird that my most defining pieces of Star Wars, I wouldn't actually like if they were movies.
Right.
But that's a big one. I think so much of the standard for the expanded universe for me was really Knights of the Old Republic. And I think the first game especially is such understands the heart of Star Wars.
Right.
So those are probably like the two big ones for me.
Well, and for me it's different too, because like you're saying, I see the films as kind of sacrosanct in a way where, even though we don't talk about levels of canon anymore, the way we used to have in the Legends canon, it's not even really about being canon, but I see it sort of levels of importance, and and that's not to say that one is, I mean, I guess it is to say that one is more important than the other, but it's not like one matters more than the other, but my expectations for one are different from the other. And there are things that I would love to see in a comic book or read in a novel or play in a video game that I guess I wouldn't think would be worthy of a film, or it would be the wrong tone for a Star Wars film. I mean, one of the things that you and I were talking about before was a book that we reviewed for our channel before. It was Star Wars Death Troopers. And then there's a sequel, Red Harvest, and they're both kind of horror novels. Zombie novels, really, set in the Star Wars universe. And they were really fun to read. I've never read a horror book before that one, so it was fun to kind of get that genre's take on Star Wars. But it would not be, for me, it would not be a good fit for a film. And I don't really know. I mean, I guess it's just the horror element of it, so maybe horror is one thing that for me is just sort of beyond the boundaries of what counts as Star Wars. But I don't even know really if I can put my finger on. I mean, it was very gory too, and so I guess that's a type of thing there also. Because that chapter is called what, Skin Hill?
Skin Hill.
So some
exactly
things you never
what
forget.
You think it is.
Yep. But so like there are there are limits and there are things that I think would be too far, but it's hard for me to set down hard and fast rules of what counts as Star Wars. But really, for me, some of the best examples of what counts as Star Wars, and I'm like a lot of fans my age who are into the Legends books in this regard. I think of things like even the Thrawn trilogy, for me is I don't want to say it's essential Star Wars because I don't subscribe to this because it's not canon. It's unimportant or we're somehow wrong or whatever. But like that really encapsulated a lot of things that are Star Wars to me. In the new Legends or in the new canon, after the Legends reboot, I think about things like Bloodline to me. Like Bloodline feels like true Star Wars, even Aftermath. I mean, in a book like Lost Stars is different because it's taking place, in things we've already seen. But for it to be something new, like Bloodline, it feels like Star Wars to me. But I know you're into kind of the technical side of film production and stuff, and I know you have thoughts, and other people have had thoughts about kind of the different technical aspects of Star Wars. Whereas for me, I think a lot of it's more thematic. But what do you think about some of these? Like, are there technical things that make Star Wars for you?
Well, the big points that a lot of people talk about are like Rogue One didn't have a crawl,
right?
So Solo is likely to not have a crawl. It did have a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, which I didn't remember if it did or didn't. I recently checked that, but it didn't have Rogue One didn't have the crawl. We had like an opening scene, and then we had the Rogue One title come up, and I remember it bugging me because it wasn't even in the right font and it wasn't the right music.
Right.
But for me, that was kind of it was a big sticking point among fans, is whether or not the movies was going to open with like the scrolling words and blah blah blah, because these weren't going to be an episode. It can't say Star Wars Episode 3.75. When we stole the Death Star plans.
More like 3.99 if we're going to be precise.
Yes, exactly. Star Wars almost Episode 4. And there were a lot of fans who didn't want the crawl because they wanted the films to be separate, which bothers me every time because every game has a crawl. Yeah. Comics have crawls. I've read novels that have crawls, and I passive aggressively, anytime I see a crawl in something that isn't a Star Wars film, I put it on the internet somewhere to be like, oh, hey, look, I guess it's it. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. But so like at some level, to me, I was upset that Rogue One didn't have that scroll, because that to me is a very Star Warsy thing. And like the argument that it keeps the episodic films special also didn't make sense to me, because effectively then what you do is you make Rogue One like every other movie. Like it doesn't make Rogue One special for it to not have a crawl. It makes it any other movie, where giving it a crawl makes it special. But I can't say that it bothered me so much that I don't think Rogue One is Star Wars. You know what I mean? Like it's just, it's kind of like if you need so many checks, so many boxes checked to be a Star Wars film, it just didn't get that check, but it hit other important checks. I know you were talking about wipes. There's a lot of people who think it's not Star Wars without the wipe transition. I think that one bothers me less because I'm not sure I would notice it, as bad as that sounds. But I guess it's something I would prefer to be there. Another thing that Rogue One did that I didn't like was I didn't like the locator cards. Like, this planet is Yavin 4. This planet is blah, blah, blah. And I think the real reason why that bothers me is there's one planet in Rogue One that didn't get a locator text, and that was Mustafar, where Darth Vader's castle is. And then I was like, well, did they not put it there because it's supposed to be a mystery where Darth Vader's castle is? And literally the next day on Twitter, Pablo was like, oh no, it was Mustafar. And I'm like, then why didn't it have a title card? Like, you're not even being consistent in your own inconsistencies. Like, everything about that bothered me. But again, not enough where I can't watch Rogue One, or I don't think it counts or whatever.
Our pal Solo Pirate agrees with you about the crawl. And Ryan Bullock in the chat asked an interesting question. He said, I wonder if the live action TV series will have a crawl. That's something I've not actually thought about.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
One thing I really enjoyed about the Clone Wars, I mean, the Clone Wars didn't have a crawl, but I mean, the Rebels didn't have anything like this, but the Clone Wars had that kind of like World War II newsreel. Yeah, kind of reporter at the head of it that kind of served the same function as a crawl. And that really worked for me, and I always enjoyed that because it gives you a little bit of context to what's going on. And I think Rebels was a little bit more intimate than that. But what do you think about one, whether or not you believe the live action show might have a crawl, or would you want it to, or like would it be an episode by episode crawl? Because if it's a half-hour show, that's like 22 minutes of,
right.
Which I would think it'd probably be an hour. But anyway, what do you think about that?
Well, I was going to bring up the same thing you did, which was the Clone Wars newsreel, and I really liked that. And I remember I was one of the people who actually saw the Clone Wars movie in theaters. And I remember wondering if it was going to have a crawl or not, and it had the newsreel on it, and I really liked that for exactly what you just said. Clone Wars is 22 minutes. The newsreels were able to serve the purpose of a crawl, but faster, right? So when you have the crawl, you have to let it go slow enough for everyone to be able to read it. The newsreels let us just get to it faster while still having that introduction.
Right.
And I liked that, and I would be cool if they wanted to utilize that on the Disney Flicks, for lack of a better term, show. I like you said, obviously Rebels didn't have it. Rebels kind of did the opening scene title thing.
Sure.
Kind of like what Rogue One did,
a cold open kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So they still did something to introduce it in the same way that Rogue One did it, and Rogue One will probably, or Solo will probably do that, where we'll probably have a scene and then Solo a Star Wars story. Right. For the live action show, I think whether or not I think it could be interesting if they did like a season crawl, because I know with comics, with trade paperbacks, I think individual issues also have crawls.
They do.
That function as previously on. And then if you get the trade paperback, you don't get the crawl of every issue. You get the crawl at the beginning of the arc.
Right.
I think a crawl could be, or something like it, would be really cool as a way to do previously on, but make it Star Wars. I think I would rather have some kind of, I mean, if it's like a Netflix show, something you would binge, they don't necessarily need a previously on, so they might not do it.
Right.
But if they were going to do it, I think that would be a cool function of it. Kind of make it a TV thing while also doing a scroll thing. But otherwise, I think my rule with the crawl is a little bit different when it comes to TV, just because you have so little time to get to the story. Where in a comic book, it's just one page.
Yeah.
And people can take however much time they want to read it there.
That makes sense to me. Couchbum in the chat says he kind of takes the opposite position, that he likes having the crawl just for the episode. So there is some variety there. For me, I can kind of take it or leave it. I can see the argument both ways, and I don't feel like I would not have felt bad if Rogue One had a crawl, and I don't feel particularly slighted that it doesn't. I do, and I'm really torn personally because I like the crawls because it kind of ties it into, that George Lucas Saturday morning serial kind of thing. I mean, to think about the TV show having a crawl, that's like where they come from, with these sort of serialized things that Lucas liked growing up. But what I'm torn about now is whether or not I want Solo to have one, because intrinsically I like them. But there's also part of me that really wants there to be some editorial continuity across these anthology films. Such that it might bother me a little bit. I mean, it wouldn't be something I cared about too much. But it would bother me a little bit if Solo had one now that Rogue One didn't.
I think my biggest sticking point is, and people don't really believe me, but like my biggest thing about the crawls is I have been asked by numerous people when Rogue One takes place.
Right.
And I try to tell this to people and they don't believe me because they're like, but isn't Darth Vader in it?
Right.
Isn't the Death Star in it? Don't we see a young Princess Leia? And I look at them and say, yes. And they ask me anyway.
Yeah.
And it's like, can I just get a scroll? So it's like, can I get a frequently asked questions thing put in front of this movie so that people will stop asking me their questions? It's kind of how I feel about it.
Well,
So it's like, I would even say screw continuity across the films if it means no one's going to ask me when Han Solo takes place.
how would you feel since you don't like that? Was it called non-diegetic text?
Non-diegetic text, yeah.
How would you feel if it just opened and it said 10 years before the destruction of the Death Star or something like that for Solo?
Like
it would be
diegetic text like that. Like it wouldn't really bother me because in the same way the scroll doesn't bother me or long time ago doesn't bother me because stuff like that at the beginning or at the end of a film doesn't take me out of it in the same way putting it up like in the middle of it for no particular reason kind of bothers me.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to start off and say based on a true story. That's what I want. But so I know for me, and I know this might be the case for you too, so you can talk about this if you like. But for me, a lot of what makes Star Wars to me is thematic and some of the type of story beats. I know Darth Knox is in the chat today, and he's not gonna like this, but I don't feel like Star Wars has to always be about Jedi and Sith. I don't even think Star Wars has to be about Force users. But for me, one thing that makes Star Wars essentially Star Wars is the type of spirituality aspect of the franchise. Like what we see with Baze and Chirrut in Rogue One, or like what we see with Lyra Erso in the Catalyst book, or things like that. I that's what I appreciate is this sort of, I mean, and even these sort of large, like, and it's something that sets, like, I really enjoy science fiction. Like, I'm a big Star Trek fan, and I talk about that sometimes. But Star Wars is not science fiction. It's science fantasy because it is very much about these mythologies and these mythological things. And so, like, you can take like a lot of the story of Anakin is like a Oedipus style story about fate. And they ask these big sort of mythological questions about the nature of good and evil. Like, that's the type of stuff that I expect from my Star Wars. And again, that doesn't mean, like, I've got books on the shelf behind me that, again, are Star Wars zombie stories, and I've got a Star Wars Ocean 11 story. I mean, honestly, I think that's what the Solo movie is going to be, is a heist film. And so, like, it's not that those things can't be Star Wars for me, but I liked the way you said it earlier, that you can check a lot of different boxes, and you don't have to check every box, but you have to check enough of them. So, like, if you don't have those large sort of mythological questions for me, but you have stormtroopers, like, there are things, and it's not like one is necessarily equal to the other, but it's about a compilation of things, not just having the one particular thing. But is there anything like that kind of makes Star Wars for you?
Well, I mean, kind of going with to what you said, in a way, I agree quite a bit with Knox, where my favorite part of Star Wars is the battle between Jedi and Sith and good versus evil.
Right.
I don't know that I need it to be that, but I prefer it to be that. Although I would be a little bit less specific than him. I'm fine with lightsiders versus darksiders. I don't necessarily need them to be Jedi and Sith.
Sure.
I have a whole series going right now that I've been neglecting for weeks, all about how I think it's bigger than Jedi and Sith in their particular hyper-focused religions. But that's really what I like, and I like how Star Wars examines good and evil within the galaxy, but also within ourselves.
Right.
And that's a big thing for me. But then you have stories like Rogue One, where I love characters like Orson Krennic, and
Sure.
Orson Krennic couldn't be less about the Force if
Right. Yeah.
he tried. You have characters like Thrawn that I love, and he doesn't like the Force because he can't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've like we were saying before, there's different checks in the box. So I know what I prefer. Like, I enjoy playing a Knights of the Republic game over, say, you're playing Star Wars Bounty Hunter right now.
Sure.
And it's fun to watch, but Bounty Hunter wouldn't speak to me in the same way that Knights of the Old Republic would. And not just because of the game type or game quality, but just in terms of the story.
Sure.
But then I'm totally fine with a Han Solo movie, which is going to have nothing to do with the Force.
Right.
But the Empire is still going to be there. And I guess where I see Star Wars is ultimately being this story about the dark side and the light side and the balance. Even though there's not really going to be like Force users, most likely, in Solo, I can still see parts of it. There's a video I'm going to release soon. I was supposed to release it yesterday, but instead of editing, I fell asleep on my computer. But I go through like when Han Solo takes place and that sort of thing, and I talk about how it's fun to see the spider web of how all of these things connect. So
Right.
even if I'm not getting more about Jedi versus Sith, I get more about the Empire, which tells me more about what Vader and Palpatine are up to.
Sure.
So, like you said, like just because there's no Jedi, if there's stormtroopers, I can still connect it to something.
Right. I mean, and I feel like I don't guess I really thought about it this way until I'm just thinking about it now. I think one of the reasons that I can enjoy Bounty Hunter and that I can enjoy the zombie novel and Scoundrels is the heist novel that I was talking about. If you've not read that,
Right.
But I know you have. But
Yep.
for chat, you have a signed copy of it, don't you?
I do. I have a friend who got me a signed copy.
But like it's a fun little novel. But I think one of the reasons that I can enjoy stuff like that is that the other stuff exists. Like
Right.
the fact that these big, mystical force powers, Jedi, Sith, good and evil, the fact that that is the main thrust of Star Wars, I think allows me to enjoy other things when those elements aren't always present.
Right.
Like, I don't think that absent of those things, Star Wars would be what it is. Or like, I don't know if that makes sense. But I feel like because when I want the spirituality, I can go and watch The Empire Strikes Back. Or when I want to play as a character with force powers, I can load up KOTOR. Like, the fact that that's there allows me to play Bounty Hunter and allows me to watch Rogue One and other things. Because it's like George Lucas created such an expansive universe where not every corner of it can be the same. The fact that not everyone is a Jedi or a Sith is what makes the Jedi and the Sith special. And so, like, there are interesting stories about those other things. But I think I would care less about those other stories. I love those other stories. But I feel like I would care less about those other stories if I didn't always have the stories that I enjoy for these other things. I don't know if any of that made sense. But
No, it makes total sense. And I think, where a lot of people talk about, they're sick of the Skywalker Saga and they're ready to see other characters or what have you. You wouldn't feel that way if we didn't have the Skywalker Saga, right? Like, in order to appreciate what's different, you have to have what's always been there.
Right.
And like that, like you said, that makes total sense. And it makes, because episodes 1 through 8 and presumably episodes 1 through 9 are going to be heavily based on the Force, the spin-off films not being about that, they make them fun side adventures,
Right.
Or even within other things. So like within Knights of the Old Republic, you have plot, you have bounty hunter side quests,
Right.
and you have all, swoop racing side quests, even though the swoop racing is annoying as all get out. But you can get so much money from it.
Yep.
Always sell your race bonds on Yavin. Don't sell them anywhere else. You'll get so rich. But that part gets fun because there's all this other stuff going on.
A couple of things to look at that people have been saying in chat that I think are things we can talk about. Echo, who's our friend Solo Pirate from the Star Wars forum, says that the thing that really makes Star Wars for him has been the ships. And he says that he couldn't sort of fit in, or he didn't feel like he could fit as much with the prequel trilogy, I guess because the ships were different. And I know he's a big Han Solo fan and has an affection for the Millennium Falcon and things like that. So how much does that influence your like what makes Star Wars for you?
Like, ships are such an interesting part of Star Wars, just as like a subculture.
Right.
Because, you know, it's funny, you and I are here sitting here talking about all this stuff, and neither of us actually thought to mention the X-Wing books that you've been reading.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
Which, even though there's Force-sensitive characters, which I may or may not have spoiled for you on accident.
Yeah. Appreciate that.
Even though you may or may not have should have remembered that from reading New Jedi Order.
15
New
years
Jedi Order
ago
would be an interesting thing to get into too when we get done with this point.
Sure.
But ships are a big deal for so many fans, and I know Styx, who's another member of Port Haven, she's really into the pilots and always like Jaina Solo because of it, or Mara Jade because of it. Pilots and ships honestly have never been my favorite. Like, it's never detracted from me. Like, I read the X-Wing novels and I really liked them, but I liked them because of the characters, not because they were pilots.
Right.
But I think that really speaks to Star Wars popularity, where there's something for everyone to connect to. There's something for anyone who wants to get into Star Wars in some way. Like, the nostalgia I feel for ships is like, say, again, to go back to KOTOR, like the Ebon Hawk, because I've spent so many hours on the Ebon Hawk.
Right.
Or Kylo Ren has fantastic taste in ships. And not just the romantic ones that you find on Twitter.
Heyo. But I also like what Knox pointed out in chat too, that one of the good thing about Star Wars ships is that they are it's a design thing too, that it's an easy sort of faction thing. And I think he says, and I think he's right when he says this, but that like ship design tells you a lot about the different factions in Star Wars. So like Imperial ships are either large and audacious, or they are meant to be like swift instruments of death. Whereas if you look at the Rebel ships, like a lot of those are different and they're cobbled together because that's what the rebellion is. And so I like that. I mean, if you look at like even in the prequel trilogy, which I know Solo Pirate said he wasn't as fond of, like the ships from Naboo are like so aesthetic and they're sleek and they're elegant because like that's what Naboo is.
Right.
And again, he's right. I think that's very Star Wars for me too. I don't know that I feel a connection to particular ships. I mean, I do like X-Wing fighters and the Falcon, you know, the same as everyone. And I have certain pilots, you know, I love Wedge Antilles, and things like that. But I think you're right though. I think it's a good that it's another example of a thing that opens that door for a lot of people to kind of latch on to different things and make it the part of Star Wars that matters to them. Let's see what other people are saying.
I see Couch Bums talking about Star Wars Galaxies. I keep meaning to, like, I gotta find a way to connect you to JPD from our site, because he played Galaxies so much. Like, he was like, he would hire himself out as like an interior decorator for people. He was like, he like had this, I don't know, he's told me so many stories that I stopped reading halfway through because he writes novels. But the two of you would enjoy talking about your Galaxy stories.
Ryan Bullock in chat also says that Star Wars for me is about hope, family, and redemption.
I,
Um,
I think he's spot on there for sure.
yeah, without a doubt.
Yeah.
And again, that more kind of thematic side of things
Mhm.
there. Um, but so you wanted to talk about the new Jedi Order for a second. What were your
Well,
thoughts
I
about?
just
Because for me, that's
yeah.
very much part of my Star Wars experience. But talk
Yeah.
to me about that for a minute if you had thoughts.
Well, I'll probably play devil's advocate here because I think we're both fans of the new Jedi Order, even though I never finished it in full disclosure, and that was not a reflection of the series. It was a reflection of how busy I got in college, and it's a 19 novel series. Like,
Yeah.
what the frick? Um, like for real. So anyway, I just got delayed and then always meant to go back to it and haven't yet. But a lot of people didn't like it because the villains of the story have no connection to the Force. Not only do they not have a connection to the Force, they can't be sensed in the Force, they can't be affected by the Force, and it seems to go against everything that was established in canon up until that point, which I can attest to because I read through Dark Journey, I think, the first
Yeah.
book on the other side of Star by Star, the one with Anakin Solo's the events of Anakin Solo.
Yeah.
And at that point, I would probably agree that I guess I can spoil a book that's ridiculously old and not canon anymore, but whatever. Um, I would probably agree that it has problems with canon, but I was just enjoying it too much to let it bother me, and I never finished it. Therefore, I was like, well, some of these problems I might have could have been solved in novel 17 of the series.
Right.
But a lot of people didn't like it for that reason, and it was much darker than other Star Wars novels had been, much more gruesome than a lot of other Star Wars novels had been. There was rampant character death. I mean, I'll just go ahead and spoil this bit. The first novel involves the death of Chewbacca.
Yep.
And that really upset people.
Right.
The notion that Chewie would die, which is why I think current canon is kind of amusing because Han dies first in current canon.
Right. So I'm trying to think about things I can say without spoiling, because I know.
I mean, I know a lot of what happens if you're worried about me.
But like for me, when you consider the new Jedi Order as a whole, like the new Jedi Order is more about the Force than any other Star Wars ever, and like the
from what I've read, I can agree with that.
Yeah. Sorry, I just saw Nox's
I know I'm laughing
pun
too.
there. But like I love the idea of the Vong not being part of the Force, especially when you get into why they're not, and I think that's what makes it more valuable. And so you don't necessarily have that early on, but like because it makes the Force like more interesting to me to think that it's not just about Jedi and Sith, but also about this other like absence. Like, and that's one of the reasons why I like the story from KOTOR 2,
Right.
because Kreia
Absolutely.
has a very different view on the Force after having been a Sith Lord. You know, she wants there to be no more Force, and so I think it's an interesting way of highlighting what is special about the Force and teaching us more about the Force by showing us the absence of it, or this kind of hole, an empty place in the Force. I mean, it's contradictory to what we had been told about it. You know, Yoda says that the Force flows through everything, and to have, you know, this group of people that for whom seemingly that's not true. Like it does seem contradictory, but I think we learn more about the Force because of what happens in the NJO.
Knox has a good point here that the would you pronounce that Salamari? I always figured it was like salamander, but with a Y in front of it because Zahn is crazy.
Just be glad it's not like 3 Y's and an X.
Salamari, yeah. Anyway, he always has too many vowels or not enough. But because they can shield themselves from the Force, he found the Vong's anomaly plausible, which is fair too. It's not like they're completely unlike anything we'd seen before. And I always found them compelling. I found their hatred of technology compelling. I thought they had a really good reason for why they hated technology. And I think it was just a great way to make the Jedi not overpowered.
Right.
Which was also an interesting thing.
Right.
What I always wondered, and maybe the later books got into this, but they'd always be like, you can't use the Force on a Vong. And I'm like, yeah, but what if you put a rug like on the ground and then the Vong walked on top of the rug and then you use the Force to lift the rug up?
Right.
Like, would that work? It's kind of like the Avengers 2 argument about how to lift Thor's hammer.
Right.
You know, I remember reading there, like, couldn't you do this though? And couldn't you do this though? And I had all these ideas.
Yeah, I'm not choking you with the Force. I'm just using the Force to remove all the air from the room.
Exactly.
But so let me ask you this. This is kind of a different way of thinking about the same question. What would be too far for you? So rather than thinking about what is essential to Star Wars, can you think of anything in particular that you would say is like would be too far?
I would say I can think of an example. In sake of fairness, I only ever read the novelization and didn't play it myself, but probably The Force Unleashed 2.
Yeah.
I think Force Unleashed 1 got there, but again, my just enjoyment of it kind of superseded my need for it to make sense. And I understand it's as a game, it's not a work of art, but I was in college when I started playing it, and when I was stressed, I would just sit there and throw the constantly, infinitely respawning stormtroopers off of things, and I felt better. So I didn't need it to be an amazing game.
That's the point of The Force Unleashed, if we're being honest.
That's the point of The Force Unleashed. It's like, you're mad, so let's kill things in weird ways.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, but the big thing with that was Starkiller was so beyond overpowered. It was ridiculous, like pulling the Star Destroyer out of the sky and that whole thing. But what I liked how they tried to balance it by he could do big things with the Force, but he couldn't do little things.
Right.
Like there's a cut scene where he's trying to assemble his lightsaber in the Force and he can't do it because it's too finesse for him. So I thought they balanced it well. And for Force Unleashed, I'd played the game and read the novelization of the game. Ironically, I will read game novelizations, but not movie novelizations. I never claimed that I make sense. Never have I claimed that I make sense. But for Force Unleashed 2, I only ever read the book, only because TFU2 wasn't ported to my system. Right. But that one, it was bigger. You know, instead of fighting Rancors, you fought a bigger mutant, not a Rancor, but it was kind of like a Rancor thing. Instead of one lightsaber, you had two lightsabers, and instead of being a clone, you were like there was like three. I don't know. There was so much going on, and it was just like at that point, it was such about being bigger for the sake of being bigger.
Right.
Which at some level is fun, and like if it was just a throwaway story, like if it was just an experiment, that would have been cool. But the fact that the game was considered part of canon,
right,
I think it had problems for me. Legends, I guess this hasn't changed, but there's a part of Star Wars called Infinities, and Infinities includes, there's a comic series that is actually like, what if the Rebels didn't destroy the Death Star? What if Luke died on Hoth? What if such and such happened? And that's really interesting. So there exists this thing in Star Wars where you have things that got written but aren't canon, and if The Force Unleashed as a series had fallen under that, I would have had way less of an issue with it. But I would say Force Unleashed is a case of being too Star Wars.
Right. For me, I think, which I'm going to give you a specific example. I don't know if you've read this in a minute, but there's a book to me that is very much not Star Wars, and I think it's exemplary of what I'm about to say. But because, like, for me, it's so important, like, the genre of this. Like, I can imagine, like, something being outside of that realm too much. And again, like we were talking before the stream started, you know, like there are things that I would read in a book or in a comic or play in a game that I wouldn't want to see in a film. And like I don't know that I would want to watch a Star Wars noir film, but I would read a Star Wars noir book or play a Star Wars noir game or something like that.
Right.
But like, even, and I guess one way to kind of put this too, like even though I think they have a lot of the same inspirations as George Lucas did, I don't know that I would necessarily want a Tarantino Star Wars film. Like just because his like kind of, I mean, he's almost a subgenre unto himself these days. But like for me, that would be too far. And I'll be honest, when Lord and Miller got signed on to do the Star Wars or for the Solo film, that I was worried about that because like it's not that I don't like their other films, but for me, I was worried about that type of humor being too not like Star Wars for me. So it's very much like a genre. Like I don't want an Adam Sandler Star Wars movie. You know, for as much as I might like Happy Gilmore and The Waterboy and stuff, like that type of comedy doesn't really fit in with Star Wars to me. But the book that I've been thinking of as an example of this, did you ever read The Crystal Star?
That one I didn't get to. I read like Dark Saber and I read Children of the Jedi.
Yeah.
But Crystal Star was not one I got to.
Well, feel lucky for it. So, like I guess it still counts as fantasy because it's like werewolves and centaurs. And it's like werewolves with like a weird Star Wars kind of spelling.
Literally about did a spit take.
Yeah. Were you unaware?
I was unaware that there were werewolves in Star Wars.
Yep. Though there is read Crystal Star, or rather don't read.
I might.
Don't read Crystal Star.
I might do like a bad read book club or something. That would be fun.
Yeah. But like that was so. This book is it's an example of like misunderstanding, like what Star Wars is to me. Like it's just like they went too far down the fantasy route, or like they just misunderstood like how far they could go into science fiction land and it still count. You know, and something like Star Trek is different. Like I love Star Trek. Star Trek can do a lot of weird things that aren't weird because Star Trek is different. But if Star Wars tried to do those things, it would be too much. And Crystal Star is a book that just goes too far for me. I mean, but I don't know. I count the holiday special as still pretty Star Wars, and there's some weird stuff that happens in there.
There's some weird stuff in there too, but there's still something about it. But you know, it kind of goes back to what Ryan was saying: is it's a movie about, or holiday special is about family.
Sure, yeah, that's true.
So at some level, it felt right.
What other thoughts do you have? We're kind of nearing the.
Yeah, we're getting to that point at the end. So if anyone has any final thoughts or off-topic questions, now is the time. Couple of, you know, I just kind of want to jump back. There were a couple of comments that popped up like after we kind of moved on that I thought I'd jump back to.
Right.
There's a person in the chat, Porkstrong, who's a really good friend on Twitter, who thinks that Solo might have a scroll just because Ron Howard did an opening scroll on Willow. So I think that's an interesting theory. I agree with the Couch Bum that Masters of Terrace Cassie is the best Star Wars game. But I also like he brings up a really good point of the Jedi were supposed to be overpowered. It's a core element to their story, and that is why they grew to be so arrogant. And that I really agree with that point. I really want to, when I get done, I have two video essay series. I'm ignoring them both because I've been bad and neglecting hard work. But when I get done with those, one of my ideas of things I want to do is a series of things that re-looks at the prequels and kind of explains some points that not to any viewer's fault, but just weren't executed as well in the prequel trilogy that I
Right.
think kind of go to the core. And I think the arrogance of the Jedi is a big part of that. So,
Well, and to think about that particular point here for a second too, I think that this is one of the things that is very similar about the Sith and the Jedi.
yep.
The Sith just don't mind being arrogant, and the Jedi want to convince themselves that they're not. And I think that's why, when Palpatine is talking to Anakin in the opera, I mean, it's about the specifics of, avoiding death, but like that's the allure of it is. The Jedi are this. They just don't want you to be.
Right.
Whereas the Sith don't care. Like the Sith will let you do your thing without the restrictions. So it's more similar there than either one would want to be.
They're gonna let you.
Yeah, sure. What else? Solo Pirate says, our conversation was ironic given that Star Trek is supposed to be set in our universe in the future, and we accept the weirdness, but Star Wars should stay grounded. And Couchbum points out that Star Wars was in the past.
It's true.
A long time ago. Indiana Jones verified that in Legends canon.
It did.
Yep.
Yeah, and I agree with Solo Pirate. Always thought time travel in Star Wars would be over the top. I mean, that's a pretty massive Rebel spoiler, but at the same time, not. Like, I'm almost reticent to tell people that there's time travel in Rebels because I don't want them to be like, because it really doesn't even feel like time travel. It's time travel only in the technical sense that a person moves from one time to another faster than time.
Right.
But it wasn't even done through science-y time travel. It was, I thought they handled it really well.
I mean, and really for me, that didn't really count as time travel because it was more about the point that the Force connected everything.
Exactly.
Like in the cosmic Force, the past and the future are the same thing. And it wasn't about, in Star Trek, let's slingshot around a sun or open up a rip in space-time or something and like travel through time. Yep, now chat's freaking out.
Way to go, man.
But like I don't even, like you said, I don't really even count what happened in Rebels as time travel. I mean, if there was gonna be time travel in the way we think about time travel, J.J. Abrams would have done it, and he didn't. So
that was
no
one
worries
joke I
about
made.
that.
Was like, how mad is J.J. Abrams that somebody else did time travel in Star Wars? It really isn't though. It's a hole in the Force. So the Force binds. We always understood the Force as connecting all life and binding all space. We learned that it also connects all of space and all of time. So through the Force, and to be fair, at some level that existed in Legends. Are you familiar with flow walking? So flow walking was in the Legacy of the Force series, I believe, which I never got to because I never finished the New Jedi Order. But Jason Solo, who was the oldest, well, Han and Leia in Legends had twins. I can't remember if Jaina or Jason was older. But one of the older children of the Solos had the ability to use the Force to flow walk, which is to look into the past, and he could walk around in the past.
All right.
And there were scenes where he could like go back to the Jedi Temple through using the Force. And of course, I can never remember what it's called, but the Force power that Quinlan Vos has.
Yeah. If you hadn't asked me about it, I would have known.
Yeah, Quinlan Vos has the Force power to pick up an object and sense through the Force where that object has been, which and that's in canon. That's in Star Wars: The Clone Wars. They brought it in from the comic books, and that absolutely involves seeing through the Force from one point in time to a different point in time. Yeah, so what Rebels did was basically take a concept that had already existed in Star Wars and take it from it being a vision to the ability to communicate with people across time as opposed to just across space. I actually have a shameless plug. I have a video on how I think what we saw in Rebels actually explains how Force Skype works in The Last Jedi. But it's total speculation, but that's just my pet theory.
Yeah, I mean, so like it's time travel, but without, like, because in other science fiction, the whole point of time travel is paradox, or
Right.
like I mean, it's not like Star Trek or Doctor Who kind of time travel.
Right.
It's way more philosophical and metaphysical than that.
Yes.
Um,
Which is why it worked.
yeah. Um, Anything else? Other thoughts? Anything else you want to address or touch on before we wrap it up?
No, I think I hit all of the comments that I wanted to. We had some really good friends here. So as always, members of the Wolf Pack are here. We're here. McYagi had to jet out. Couch Bum, Sergeant Curry Pants, are part of the YouTube Wolf Pack, which Port Haven is part of. We're a group of streamers and YouTubers and Twitchers and whatnot that all support each other. Pork Strong and Ryan Bullock are friends from Twitter. Solo Pirate from Port Haven. Knox is a longtime friend that I actually met through. It's actually Knox and I actually met as both as viewers in a person's XCOM 2 stream that we never went back to because they never streamed XCOM 2 again. And then found each other in different XCOM 2 streams and became friends. So it's always cool to see Knox around. We have a long running friendship. Oh, and hey, Melodic Cynical, same thing. I know from just popped in chat. I know from other things. Unfortunately, I think we're about ready to end, buddy. But
Yeah.
and Bear. I knew how could I forget Bear? Bear's the best. Bear's also he's a bear that streams and naked. He's a naked bear that streams, and so everyone should check them out. So if you're here and you make content too, just go ahead and I don't know if you're not a mod, you probably can't post a link, but just like raise your hand and wave.
Right.
At the end of the stream, I'm totally fine with people self-promoting.
And B-Man was here earlier.
B-Man, he popped in and said hi. He's another content
and
maker.
Tyler Brusso, who is in the chat,
yes.
too. Tyler just started doing some writing for our blog site.
Yeah, he's been really cool to work with.
So yeah, so look for more from him coming up soon. Also,
which is why you should check out port-haven.com and see more than just our YouTube page because that's where you can find his stuff.
Yeah, and so so make sure that you're not just watching our live streams, which we love it that you do. We're glad that you've come out and hung out with us today. But make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. Hit that little bell so you can get notified when we go live. I don't want to spoil too much, but if you hit that little bell to get notified when we go live, you might get more than one notification next week.
Yes.
So we've been talking about that some on Twitter.
Yep. Which is, follow us at Port Haven Forums. It's all there on the Doodly Bop.
Yep.
On below me. But yeah, we hit 250 subscribers just yesterday, actually. And to celebrate, I may or may not be streaming something that we talked a lot about today, actually. Probably Tuesday, which might not mean anything to you if you're watching this not on the day it came out.
Right, yes.
Fair warning, if you're watching this in the future through Rebels Like Time Travel, it might not actually be Tuesday anymore.
But yeah, so make sure you're following us on Twitter. We have a Facebook page you can follow. I share all sorts of Facebook Star Wars memes on there too. Make sure you're checking out our blog site. Again, we just posted an interview. It's been over a week ago now, but if you haven't seen our last interview with Ken Liu on there, you can find that there. You can check out our forums as well. So again, it's Port Haven Day. It's the birthday of our forums. So what better way to celebrate 7 years as a forum site than to go join our forums and check us out there. It's forums.port-haven.com, or there's a link there if you just go to our main page.
We're big fans of putting punctuation in our web addresses.
Yep.
But if you want, actually, I should have a link in the description to the thread on the forums where we were discussing what Star Wars means to us. So if you have more to say that you didn't get to say on the stream or I somehow missed your comment, you can always make an account and post it there and get to know some of the people around the site there.
But I think that's going to do it for us until next week, guys. So thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you around.
So great to see everyone. Bye.
Bye.